Today we will be looking at the case of two deserters who fled the army, shot, and killed FBI Special Agent Hubert Treacy. Two FBI agents walked into a diner to ask two young men a few questions. One agent never walked back out. This case involves an act of gun violence against law enforcement and the events that followed it. Nothing here is graphic. And if this is your first time joining us here on this channel, kindly take your time and hit on the subscribe button and turn on notifications to be notified whenever we drop new cases on here. In early March 1942, two young soldiers stationed with a machine gun troop of the 3rd Cavalry at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, decided they were done with the Army. Charles Lovett was 21. James Testerman was 22. Both men already had troubled service records behind them, past punishments for being absent without leave, for showing up to duty while intoxicated. Neither man was new to trouble. What they were about to do was something else entirely. Just after midnight on March 12th, the two men made their move. They went to the quarters of the man in charge that night, Sergeant Clifton Hall, and incapacitated him using an object taken from the mess hall porch. With Hall down, they broke into a nearby room and stole 4 military revolvers along with roughly 100 rounds of ammunition. The timing mattered. This was March 1942, just 3 months after Pearl Harbor. The United States was fully at war, and desertion from a military post was not treated as a minor disciplinary matter. It was a federal offense with serious consequences, and stealing government firearms during wartime only escalated what these two men were facing. Whatever punishment they were trying to avoid by running, they had just made their situation considerably worse. Then they ran. Lovett and Testerman made it off the base and onto a nearby highway, where they flagged down a taxi. Once inside, they forced the driver to take them at gunpoint out of Georgia and toward Tennessee. Near Cleveland, Tennessee, they pulled the driver from his own cab, searched him, and took $23 from him before continuing on without him. The stolen cab carried them to Sweetwater, Tennessee, where they finally abandoned it. From there, they switched to a bus. Along the way, in Knoxville, they stopped just long enough to buy a handbag, something ordinary enough to carry 4 stolen revolvers and a stash of ammunition without drawing a second glance. By the time they reached Knoxville, Lovett and Testerman had already crossed 2 state lines and left behind a kidnapping, a robbery, and a stolen vehicle. In 1942, that combination of crimes meant they were now squarely within federal jurisdiction, not just a matter for local police or the Army. The National Motor Vehicle Theft Act and federal kidnapping statutes both applied the moment they crossed from Georgia into Tennessee, which is part of why the FBI, not just military police, ended up leading the search for them. By late afternoon on March 12th, they had reached Abingdon, Virginia, a small town where, investigators would soon learn, Testerman had a girlfriend. They checked into an inn for the night, unaware that federal agents were already moving. The disappearance of 2 armed soldiers had not gone unnoticed. By the morning of March 12th, the FBI's field office in Knoxville had already been alerted, and agents from multiple offices across the South and East were being pulled onto the case. Warrants were issued for violations of federal vehicle theft and kidnapping law. Coordinating a manhunt like this one across state lines in 1942 was no small task. There was no shared national database, no way to instantly flag a name at a bus station or an inn. Field offices worked by telephone and telegraph, comparing descriptions, tracking reported sightings, and relaying information between cities as fast as the era's communication would allow. Every hour Lovett and Testerman spent moving from Georgia to Tennessee to Virginia was an hour multiple field offices were working to close the gap between them and the two deserters. When investigators learned that Testerman had a personal connection to Abingdon, that information was passed directly to the Bureau's Richmond field office. The net was tightening, and Lovett and Testerman didn't know it yet. The morning of March 13th, 1942, started like any other in Abingdon. At 9:35, Special Agents Hubert Treacy and Charles Tignor were driving through town when Treacy spotted 2 soldiers walking along the street. Something about them matched the descriptions the Bureau had circulated. The agents parked and followed the 2 men into a small café, where Lovett and Testerman had just sat down and ordered breakfast. This was, by every account, meant to be a routine approach. Agents confirming identities of suspected deserters was not an unusual task during wartime, and there was nothing in the moment to suggest it would end differently than any other stop like it. Treacy and Tignor had no reason to expect the two young men in the booth would respond with gunfire rather than words. Treacy and Tignor approached the booth, identified themselves as FBI agents, and asked the two men who they were. There was no warning before Lovett reached for his weapon. What happened over the next several seconds would end one man's life and change another's forever. Both agents went down. Lovett and Testerman ran from the café, leaving behind two wounded men and a room full of witnesses who had just watched a routine identity check turn into gunfire. Agent Tignor tried to get up and follow them into the street. He collapsed before he could. Both agents were rushed to a hospital in Abingdon. Special Agent Hubert Treacy was pronounced dead on arrival. Agent Tignor survived, though it took weeks before he left that hospital bed. Outside the café, Lovett and Testerman were still running, and they weren't finished. They tried and failed to steal a car in the street. When they finally did manage to take one from a local resident, they didn't get far. As they approached an intersection, a local police officer drove his own car into their path, blocking the road and triggering another armed confrontation right there in the middle of town. Somewhere in the chaos of their escape, shots were fired toward a car carrying four women who happened to be nearby. The two men abandoned that fight and fled to the edge of town, where they broke into the basement of a house and barricaded themselves inside. It didn't take long for the house to be surrounded. FBI agents, local police, and officers from a nearby civilian defense training school converged on the property. That last group was in the area somewhat by coincidence. They had been attending a training program in nearby Bristol, Virginia, preparing for a very different kind of wartime responsibility, and instead found themselves pulled directly into an active manhunt. From inside, Lovett and Testerman shouted at the officers outside as the standoff continued. The standoff ended only after tear gas was used to force them out. Left with no way to hold out any longer, Lovett and Testerman finally threw down their weapons and walked out with their hands raised. Less than 24 hours after they deserted Fort Oglethorpe, both men were in custody. A federal grand jury in Harrisonburg, Virginia, moved fast. On March 19th, just 6 days after the shooting, both men were formally indicted for the murder of Special Agent Treacy, charged under federal statutes covering the killing of a federal officer. Their trial opened at the federal courthouse in Abingdon on April 15, 1942, the same town where the shooting had taken place a little over a month earlier. It didn't last long. 2 days later, on April 17th, a jury found both Lovett and Testerman guilty of first-degree murder. The jury recommended against the death penalty. Following that recommendation, the judge sentenced both men to life in prison. For most cases, that would be the end of the story. This one wasn't finished yet. There was a problem, and federal prosecutors knew it. Under the law at the time, a life sentence still came with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Lovett and Testerman had been convicted of murdering a federal agent, and there were people in the bureau and in the courts who were not willing to leave the door open for early release. So prosecutors kept building cases. On April 28, 1942, a federal grand jury in Chattanooga indicted the two men on kidnapping charges and vehicle theft, tied to the stolen taxi and its terrified driver. Weeks later, on May 18th, a grand jury in Rome, Georgia added a third set of charges. Then the case stalled. Key witnesses were serving overseas as the country fought through the remainder of World War II, and a trial on the new charges wasn't possible. It took until November 19, 1946, more than 4 years after Treacy's death, for the case to move forward again. In Rome, Georgia, Lovett and Testerman finally pleaded guilty to 3 federal charges: assault on a government reservation, robbery of government property, and interstate transportation of stolen government firearms. The judge stacked the sentences on top of what they were already serving. 12 additional years, to begin only after their life sentences for Treacy's murder had ended or been legally satisfied. The message was clear. Even a life sentence wasn't going to be the whole story for these two men. Behind the badge and the case file was a 29-year-old man who had only been an FBI agent for less than a year. Hubert Treacy was born in New York City in January 1913. He came up through Catholic schools in the city, spent a semester at Fordham, then transferred to Georgetown University, where he earned his undergraduate degree in 1935. From there, he went on to law school at St. John's University in Brooklyn, finishing his law degree in 1939 and staying on for a year of graduate study after that. Before joining the Bureau, he worked for Bethlehem Steel. He entered FBI service on April 1, 1941, not even a full year before the morning that would cost him his life. He was active in his community, a member of the Knights of Columbus, the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, the American Irish Historical Society, and the Quartermaster Association. He left behind a widow, his mother, and 2 sisters. Hubert Treacy's death made him part of a list no agent wants to join. FBI personnel killed in the line of duty. Agents killed this way are formally memorialized by the Bureau, their names entered into the permanent record of those who died carrying out federal law enforcement work. For an agent who had been with the Bureau less than a year, Treacy's case became one of the clearer examples, in the FBI's own historical record, of how quickly an ordinary assignment could turn fatal during the manhunts and wartime enforcement work of the early 1940s. He was not a veteran investigator working a high-profile case. He was a young agent doing exactly what agents were trained to do: approach, identify themselves, ask questions. It went wrong in the space of a few seconds, with no opportunity to do anything differently. Unlike a lot of the cases we cover on this channel, this one didn't stay unsolved, and it didn't stay quiet. 2 men were caught within a day. They were convicted within weeks. And when the system's ordinary sentence didn't feel like enough, prosecutors spent the better part of 4 more years making sure it was. What stays with this case isn't the mystery. It's the speed of it. One ordinary morning, one moment of hesitation that never came, and a chain reaction that spread from a Georgia Army base to a Virginia diner to a courtroom in Rome, Georgia, for years later. Special Agent Hubert Treacy didn't get to finish his first year with the Bureau. This is what happened in the year that he did. If you want more cases built on real records instead of recycled summaries, subscribe and turn on notifications for next week's episode. Let me know in the comments what stood out to you most about this case, and where in the world you're watching from.